Hi, everybody. This is Professor Tannenbaum, and I wanted to give you some information today about identifying limitations in psychology research. I have found over the years that this is something that students often really struggle with, particularly on their infographics. So I wanted to walk you through some examples so you can see what would make a good limitation. When we talk about a limitation of research, we are talking about something that the researchers could have done better. It doesn't mean that their study was poorly designed. It's just that every study, I don't care how well designed it is inherently imperfect. No one researcher can do it all. This is why we have so many follow-up studies. Every individual study is looking at one small piece of a giant jigsaw puzzle, and eventually we can put all of that data together to get a sense of the bigger picture. There are two key characteristics of a good limitation. The first is that it needs to be specific to the study that you are talking about. It can't just be a general statement like correlation doesn't prove causation. That's true, but I want to see in your infographic that you've thought about how general research design principles apply to this particular study. The second key characteristic is it needs to be something that would affect the pattern of the results. If it's a correlational study, we're looking for something that would change the strength or the direction of the correlation. And if it's an experiment or a quasi-experiment, then this means something that would change the magnitude of the difference between the results for each group. If you're trying to think about how to identify a limitation, some suggestions are to think about how the results might be different if the researcher used a different sample, or collected data in a different way, or added in one or more new variables. So now I'm going to give you a few examples to work through together, and then I will link you to a self-test at the end. We're going to start with a study that was published in 2014 with the very catchy title of "The Pen is Mightier Than the Keyboard." In this study, the researchers had college students watch a TED Talk, then take a multiple choice quiz after a 30-minute break. They were instructed to use their usual note-taking strategy, but they were randomly assigned to do so using either paper and pen or a laptop. They found that those who used paper tended to have more concise notes, whereas the ones using laptops not only wrote more, but they tended to do a lot more verbatim dictation. On the quiz, those who had used paper scored higher on conceptual questions, although they did equally well on factual ones. If I were to ask students for limitations of this study, I might get someone pointing out that the participants were tested after only 30 minutes, and we might expect to see different results if they were tested, say, a day or a week later. This is not a bad answer, but it is also not a great one because it doesn't have an explanation as to why the student would expect to see different results with a different time frame. A better answer, one that would get full credit, would be if a student pointed out that in a real class, tests usually happen on a later date and people have a chance to review their notes. So if we made the process more realistic, we might expect a smaller difference between written and typed notes. This next example is about a hypothetical study in which a researcher finds that college chemistry students who do a mindfulness exercise before their final exam get higher scores than another group that does not do the mindfulness exercise. A student might propose as a limitation that if they had used high school chemistry students, then test scores would be worse overall. This is not a particularly good answer because it doesn't impact the pattern of the results. Yes, we would expect high school students to generally get lower scores on the exam, but we're still predicting that students who did the mindfulness exercise will get higher scores than those who don't. The last example I'm going to give you comes from a study in which the researchers surveyed teenage girls about how often they watched MTV reality shows. They found that those who identified more with the characters, meaning they wanted to be like the characters or they felt empathy for the characters, were more materialistic 6 months later. One limitation might be that when this data was collected, shows only came out once a week, and we might get different data if the girls had binge watched the shows. This is actually a pretty good answer, but it's not a great one, again, because there's no explanation of why we would expect this to yield different results. A much better answer would be if the student added an additional sentence pointing out that when people binge watch, they might identify much more strongly, which might make the correlation between identification and materialism even stronger. Now, would we actually get those results? I honestly have no idea. But the point is that the suggestion was a reasonable one, and that's all I need from you. Looking at that same study, another proposed limitation is that all of the data was collected from the girls themselves, and we might find a different pattern of results if we asked their parents about the girls' level of materialism. In this case, there's no third sentence, but I don't think it's needed because it just seems intuitive that people don't always evaluate their own personality traits the same way that other people would. So this would be an excellent answer all by itself. Now it's time for you to go test yourself. Use the QR code or the link to go to a short quiz. It will give you 4 proposed limitations relating to that study about using laptops versus paper to take notes. You'll evaluate each one in a sentence or 2, and then after you submit the quiz, you'll be able to get my feedback as to how I would score each answer on a quiz or on an assignment. Good luck, and as always, please don't hesitate to ask if you have any questions.